Mark Henderson had never imagined that a small fender bender could turn into something so unsettling. 35 years old, a graphic designer by trade, he was usually the type to stay home, working late nights on client projects. But on that rainy afternoon, fate decided to throw a curveball in the form of a car accident. Nothing too serious, just enough to get him admitted to a rural hospital in the middle of nowhere. The hospital itself gave off a vibe, like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. Its creaky floors and dimly lit corridors whispered of stories long forgotten. You know, the kind of place where silence isn't comforting, but unnerving? Yeah, that's where Mark found himself. His room, tucked away at the far end of the hallway, seemed even more isolated. The nurses didn't make much small talk, and honestly, Mark wasn't in the mood to chit-chat either. But what struck him as odd was how they always seemed to avoid the door right next to his room. It was locked, unmarked, and had this strange aura that made even the most seasoned nurse glance away in discomfort. When Mark asked about it, one nurse simply gave a tight-lipped smile and walked away. Another just mumbled something about it being out of service. Yeah, sure, because every hospital has a random off-limits room, right? As night fell, the strangeness of the place began to settle in. It wasn't just the hospital's dated appearance. It was something else, something that hung in the air, like an unsolved puzzle. Mark tried to sleep, but every little noise, a distant footstep, the rattle of a vent, set his nerves on edge. Then, from the room next door, came the faintest of whispers. At first, Mark thought it was his imagination, maybe someone on the night shift muttering to themselves, right? But it didn't sound like that. It sounded wrong. Low, like it was buried beneath layers of the building itself. He mentioned it to a passing nurse the next morning, but she just brushed it off, muttering something about old pipes and acoustics. Mark wasn't convinced, though. Something felt off about this place. The whispers weren't just noise, they were words, faint but distinct. He couldn't quite catch what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, and somehow it seemed like they were directed at him. It's that feeling when you know someone's looking at you from across a crowded room. Except in this case, there was no one to see. As the day wore on, Mark tried to shake it off. After all, hospitals were always creepy at night. But when evening came again, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder. And this time, Mark wasn't about to ignore them. It was as if the hospital itself was urging him to listen, to pay attention. And that locked door? Well, it felt more like a boundary, a line he wasn't supposed to cross. But curiosity has a funny way of twisting logic, doesn't it? By the third night, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers were getting bolder, louder, almost like they were trying to get his attention. It wasn't just some passing noise anymore. It was intentional, deliberate. Lying in his bed, staring at the ceiling, he tried to block it out, but it was impossible. The more he tried to ignore it, the more insistent it became. And as strange as it sounded, it felt like the whispers were calling him specifically. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Were the sounds really coming from that locked room? And if so, why? Mark had always been a rational guy. Graphic designers deal with structure, with balance, with the visual side of things that make sense. But this? This was beyond explanation. So, when he found a moment alone the next day, he stopped one of the younger nurses who seemed friendlier than the rest. After a bit of small talk, Mark cautiously brought up the locked room. At first, the nurse looked away, clearly uncomfortable. But when he pressed her, she finally relented, her voice barely above a whisper. She told him about a patient, a woman, who had once stayed in that very room. The nurse's story wasn't filled with details, but the bits she did share were enough to send a chill down Mark's spine. The woman had died under violent, mysterious circumstances years ago. Some said it was an accident, others whispered of something darker. The hospital had sealed the room ever since, and the staff had strict orders not to speak about it. That's why the nurses always avoided the topic, why they never stayed near the room for too long. According to the nurse, ever since the woman's death, strange things had been happening. Some staff even claimed to hear her voice, late at night, crying for help. Mark's stomach knotted with unease, But the nurse's words had only stoked his curiosity. He wasn't superstitious by nature, but something about the way she described the woman's death left him on edge. The thought of a restless spirit lingering in that room was unsettling, to say the least. And yet, there was a part of him that wanted to know more. He had to know more. What if the whispers he was hearing were hers? What if she was still there, trying to reach out, to communicate? As the day wore on, the idea festered in Mark's mind. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the mundane details of his hospital stay, but the whispers wouldn't let him forget. That night, as he lay in bed, the sounds came again, but this time they weren't faint or distant. They were guttural, low moans, as if someone was in pain, calling out from beyond the grave. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He had never felt so trapped, so cornered. The nightmares began soon after. Mark dreamt of the woman, her face twisted in agony, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She was reaching out to him, begging for something he couldn't understand. Her voice, echoing in his mind, was filled with desperation. When he woke up, drenched in sweat, the whispers hadn't stopped. They followed him from the dream into reality, and now they felt closer than ever. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, feeding on his fear. By the time the storm rolled in that night, the atmosphere in the hospital had shifted entirely. Mark could feel it in the air, the weight of something unnatural pressing down on him. The whispers had grown into full-blown cries of pain and anger, and the room next door seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Thunder rattled the windows, but it wasn't the storm that kept him awake. It was the overwhelming sense that something was waiting for him, just beyond that locked door. He tried to tell himself it was his mind playing tricks, but deep down, he knew better. At first, Mark thought he could ride it out, ignore the sounds, focus on the rain drumming against the window, anything to distract himself, but it was no use. The cries became louder, more insistent, and before he knew it, his feet were moving, dragging him toward the door he had been told to avoid. His heart pounded in his chest, each step heavier than the last. And then, without warning, the door creaked open on its own, as if it had been waiting for him all along. The dim light from the hallway spilled into the room, revealing only darkness beyond. The moment he crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped sharply. The air was thick with the scent of something long dead and decaying. Mark's breath came out in short, sharp bursts, the cold biting at his skin. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw it, her, the woman from his nightmares, standing at the foot of his bed, just as he had seen her in his dreams. But this time, she was real. Her face was twisted beyond recognition, her features contorted in a grotesque mask of agony and rage. Her hollow eyes stared straight through him, as if she were looking at his soul. Her voice was nothing like the whispers he had heard before. It was harsh, filled with bitterness and pain as she began to speak. She accused him, her words laced with anger, telling him that he had ignored her suffering, that he had let her die alone. Mark stood frozen, unable to move or speak as she inched closer. Her presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Every instinct told him to run, but his legs refused to move. She told him she wasn't alone, that others were coming, and that this was just the beginning. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered wildly, casting long, erratic shadows on the walls. Mark's heart raced as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't a dream, wasn't some figment of his imagination. She was here, in the flesh, or what was left of it, and she wasn't going to let him leave without making him pay. The cold in the room intensified, freezing his breath in the air, and for a brief moment, Mark thought he saw other figures, just out of the corner of his eye, lurking in the shadows. Panic surged through him, and finally his body responded. He stumbled backward out of the room, his eyes wide with terror. The door slammed shut behind him, but the damage was done. The woman's face was burned into his mind, her voice still echoing in his ears. She had made it clear. She wasn't going to let this go. Even as he ran down the hall, the weight of her presence followed him. He could feel her, watching, waiting for the moment when she would strike again. And he knew, deep down, that she wasn't finished with him yet. Mark's heart was pounding as he sprinted down the hallway, his legs shaky from the sheer terror he had just faced. Every step felt like a struggle, as if the air around him had thickened, trying to pull him back. The hospital that had once seemed eerily quiet was now filled with an unbearable tension, every shadow hiding something unseen. Mark didn't care anymore if the nurses thought he was crazy. All he wanted was to get out, to put as much distance as possible between him and that room. His hands shook as he reached the front desk, demanding to be moved to another room. The nurses, pale and tense, complied without a word, as if they knew exactly what had happened. That night, Mark was transferred to another wing of the hospital, away from the cursed room. But the sense of relief he had hoped for never came. Even though the new room was brighter, more modern, and further from the darkened corridor, the whispers followed him. They weren't as loud as before, but they were there, soft and persistent, just enough to keep him on edge. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel her, standing just out of sight, waiting for him to slip into sleep. And the worst part? The nightmares didn't stop either. Every night Mark would dream of her, that twisted figure with her hollow eyes and contorted face. In the dreams, she didn't just watch him, she reached out for him, her cold fingers brushing against his skin. The sensation was so real that when he woke up, he could still feel the icy touch lingering on his body. It didn't matter how many times he tried to convince himself it wasn't real. The fear had taken root deep inside him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was always nearby, lurking in the corners of his vision, waiting. After being discharged from the hospital the next morning, Mark felt a fleeting sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, leaving the hospital would break whatever spell had been cast over him. But that hope was short-lived. As soon as he stepped into his apartment, the oppressive feeling followed him. The shadows in his home seemed darker, the corners more threatening, and at night, the whispers came back, louder than ever. Sometimes, it was just a few words, barely audible, but other times, they were clear as day, pleading, accusing, calling his name. Mark's life began to unravel. He stopped sleeping, stopped leaving his apartment unless absolutely necessary. The sense of being watched never left him, and the cold presence of the woman was always there, even when he was alone. His friends noticed the change in him, but he couldn't bring himself to explain. How could he? Who would believe that he was being haunted by the ghost of a woman who had died in a locked hospital room? No one could understand the terror that followed him everywhere he went, the constant suffocating fear. Days turned into weeks, and Mark was living in a constant state of paranoia. Every time he turned off the lights, he would see her standing in the dark, just out of reach, waiting. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of her in the reflection of a window, or hear her footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. It was relentless, an unending nightmare that had bled into his waking life. No matter where he went or what he did, she was there, a shadow that clung to him, refusing to let go. Mark realized there was no escape. Whatever had happened in that hospital, whatever force had been unleashed, was bound to him now. The woman, the whispers, the nightmares, they weren't just confined to that one room anymore. They had followed him into every aspect of his life, and there was no way to make it stop. The worst part, he could feel her getting closer every night, inching nearer to him, as if she were biding her time. Weeks had passed since Mark's discharge from the hospital, but peace never came. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by the constant dread of what waited for him in the dark. Every night the whispers grew louder, clearer, as if the woman's voice was gaining strength. The cold spots in his apartment were undeniable now. He could feel her presence in the room with him, hear her footsteps at night. Mark was slowly losing his grip on reality. He couldn't take it anymore. Desperate for answers, or maybe just closure, he decided to return to the hospital. The moment Mark stepped back inside the hospital, it felt like walking into a nightmare. The air was thick with the same oppressive energy he'd felt during his stay, only now it was worse. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, pulsing with an unseen force that had been waiting for him to return. The nurses didn't meet his eyes this time. They seemed to know something was coming, something they couldn't stop. He didn't ask for directions. His feet carried him, almost by instinct, back to the hallway where it had all started. The door to the locked room stood closed, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like an invitation. As Mark approached the door, the whispers turned to screams. The lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows down the hall. He could hear her now, her voice filled with rage and sorrow, accusing him, begging him to understand. The door swung open slowly, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Inside, the room was just as dark and cold as before, but this time, it felt more real, more immediate. The woman appeared again, but there was something different about her. She wasn't just a ghostly figure anymore. She was solid, present, and more terrifying than ever. Mark stood frozen as the woman's hollow eyes locked onto his. Her face, twisted and broken, was filled with a hatred that made his skin crawl. She moved closer, her voice no longer a whisper but a shriek, echoing through the empty corridors. She accused him of abandoning her, of leaving her to die alone, and now she was claiming him. In that moment, Mark realized the horrible truth. She wasn't just a spirit haunting him. She had bound herself to him, and there was no escape. The hospital, the room, her, they were all connected, and now so was he. The walls of the hospital seemed to close in on him, the air thick with the presence of something far darker than he had ever imagined. Mark could hear other voices now, faint at first, but growing louder. They weren't just the woman's screams anymore. They were the voices of others, trapped within the hospital's walls, bound to the same fate. The room was filled with an overwhelming sense of despair, as if it had become a prison for lost souls. And Mark was the latest prisoner. The weight of the realization was crushing. He wasn't leaving this place. Not really. As the woman reached out for him, Mark felt the coldness of her touch seep into his skin. It wasn't just a sensation. It was as if his soul was being pulled from his body, bound to hers. The voices, the shadows, the whispers, they all converged on him, drowning out his thoughts, filling his mind with an endless stream of terror and pain. There was no running, no escaping. The woman had claimed him, just as she had claimed others before him. And now, he belonged to the hospital, to her, forever. Mark knew then, as the darkness closed in, that he was trapped. There was no final escape, no waking up from this nightmare. The woman wasn't finished with him, and neither were the other spirits that lingered in the shadows. They had waited for him, and now they had him. The hospital had become his tomb, and the whispers, once faint, now roared in his ears. This was his new reality, an unending cycle of fear, pain, and terror, with no hope of release. And out there, somewhere in the darkness, they waited for their next victim. Laura Simmons had always been proud of her work at St. Helena's Hospital. She had spent over a decade on the night shift, a routine she had come to know like the back of her hand. The quiet halls of the old wing held an eerie calmness that she'd grown used to, though she would never admit how unsettling it could be at times. The hospital itself was old, the kind of place where every footstep echoed a little too loudly, and the lights always seemed dimmer than they should be. Still, Laura had a job to do, and her years of experience made her the go-to nurse for handling the more difficult shifts. The night Mr. Barlow was wheeled in felt no different at first. Another late admission, another patient requiring intensive care. Laura had seen it all before, or so she thought. Mr. Barlow had been in a coma for a while, his breathing completely reliant on the ventilator that had been brought in with him. She didn't ask many questions. It was routine, just another night at work. But as she monitored his vitals, there was something about his presence that seemed wrong. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an undeniable chill in the air. It wasn't unusual for patients in critical condition to carry a heavy atmosphere with them. Laura had been through enough late-night emergencies to understand that death often lingered close in the ICU. But with Mr. Barlow, it wasn't just the air of impending loss. It was something darker, something unspoken that seemed to cling to the walls. Still, she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on her duties, just like every other night. The hospital staff had their own stories about the old wing. Rumors, of course. Stories whispered in the break room about patients who never left, or strange happenings that couldn't be explained. Laura had never paid much attention to those tales, chalking them up to overactive imaginations. After all, hospitals were emotional places, filled with life and death in equal measure. It was easy for people to start seeing things that weren't really there, right? But as the night went on, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that this night wasn't like the others. The clock ticked slowly, and the usual noises of the hospital, the beeping of machines, the distant hum of conversation, seemed oddly muffled. She checked on Mr. Barlow several times throughout the night, his condition stable, but his presence somehow looming. What Laura didn't know was that this night, unlike all the others, would mark the beginning of something she'd never be able to explain. Something that would haunt her far beyond the walls of St. Helena's. A sense of foreboding clung to her every movement, though she couldn't have known just how deeply it would root itself into her life. The night Mr. Barlow was hooked up to the ventilator, things started to feel off, almost immediately. Laura had experienced minor equipment malfunctions before. Machines beep at odd times, lights flicker when the power surges, but this was different. It started with a flicker of the overhead light in Mr. Barlow's room, a subtle thing that she could have easily dismissed. But then it happened again, and again. Each time she entered the room, the light would flicker, as though reacting to her presence. At first, Laura told herself it was just faulty wiring, but the frequency made her stomach tighten with unease. It wasn't just the lights either. The beeping of Mr. Barlow's heart monitor would spike randomly, only to settle down when she entered the room to check on him. She even tried to joke with herself that the machines were playing tricks, but the air in the room was heavy, almost stifling. The ventilator, though it worked perfectly fine, seemed louder than usual, like each breath it pumped into Mr. Barlow was straining against something unseen. Laura found herself glancing at the door, half expecting someone, or something, to step through at any moment. It wasn't long before other patients started complaining. Shadows, they said. Laura wasn't one to entertain fanciful notions, but when multiple patients in nearby rooms started reporting dark shapes moving around them, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. One man, in particular, swore he saw a shadow standing over Mr. Barlow's bed, staring down at the lifeless figure. Laura reassured him with her usual calm professionalism, but the pit in her stomach deepened. She didn't want to admit it, but she had started seeing things too. That night, when she walked past Mr. Barlow's room, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing near the bed out of the corner of her eye. A tall, looming shadow that disappeared the moment she turned her head. It happened so fast that she questioned if it was just her tired mind playing tricks on her. But the feeling, the cold, creeping sensation that crawled up her spine was real. Something was there, something that didn't belong. Laura wasn't one to panic, but the unease was becoming harder to ignore. As the night went on, the disturbances continued. Equipment malfunctioned, lights dimmed, and the eerie sensation of being watched lingered everywhere she went. The hospital had always been a quiet place at night, but now the silence felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. She could feel it deep in her bones. Something was coming, and it had to do with Mr. Barlow. The more time passed, the more frequent the shadows became. Even the other nurses started whispering about how strange the night had been, though no one dared voice their concerns out loud. As Laura stood at the nurses' station, staring down the long, dimly lit hallway toward Mr. Barlow's room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The night had taken on an unnatural stillness, the kind that sets every nerve on edge. But Laura continued her rounds, hoping to distract herself from the growing unease. As she walked past Mr. Barlow's room, something stopped her in her tracks. His heart monitor had flatlined, the steady beep of life that had filled the room now replaced by a single piercing tone. Laura's chest tightened, but she knew she had to act quickly. She rushed inside, expecting to see what every nurse dreads: the end. But what she saw instead was far worse. The ventilator continued its rhythmic pumping, forcing air into a body that should have been still. Mr. Barlow's chest rose and fell with an unnatural motion, as if his body had become a puppet to the machine. And then, to her utter horror, he sat up. Slowly, stiffly, his movements jerky like he was being pulled by invisible strings. His eyes snapped open, but they weren't the eyes of a living man. They were empty, dark, void of any humanity. Laura stood frozen, her mind refusing to process what was happening. As his body moved, the ventilator continued its eerie hiss, pushing air into his lungs as though it were keeping him alive. But he wasn't alive, not in the way he should be. Laura's heart raced, her instinct telling her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. The air in the room grew cold, colder than she had ever felt before, and a sense of overwhelming dread washed over her. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow. No, not just a shadow. Something darker, more sinister, standing over Mr. Barlow's bed, its presence dominating the room. The figure was tall, its form indistinct, but the menace it radiated was undeniable. Laura felt its gaze, though it had no eyes, as if it were studying her, deciding what to do next. The thing, whatever it was, seemed to control Mr. Barlow's body, moving him like a marionette. Her breath caught in her throat as Mr. Barlow's hand twitched, then extended toward her. It was then she realized she was no longer a spectator in this nightmare. She was a part of it. Panic finally surged through her body, and she stumbled backward, her feet tangling beneath her as she tried to escape the room. But before she could reach the door, something cold and skeletal latched onto her arm. It wasn't Mr. Barlow's hand. It couldn't be. It was too thin, too bony, and the grip was like ice. Laura's scream died in her throat as she looked down to see a pale, ghostly hand wrapped around her wrist, its fingers impossibly long, gripping her with an unnatural strength. She yanked her arm back, desperate to break free, but the hand wouldn't let go. It was as though the figure had stepped out of the shadows and claimed her. In that moment, Laura knew she was not dealing with a patient, or even death itself, but something far worse. Whatever it was that had come for Mr. Barlow, it was now coming for her, and she could feel its intentions, cold and calculating. It didn't just want to scare her, it wanted to take her, to pull her into whatever dark void it had come from. Finally, with a burst of adrenaline, Laura tore herself free, stumbling into the hallway. The door to Mr. Barlow's room slammed shut behind her, and the sound of the ventilator, still pumping air into that lifeless body, echoed in her ears. Laura's footsteps echoed down the empty hallway as she fled from Mr. Barlow's room, her heart pounding so violently that she could barely catch her breath. The cold air still clung to her skin, a reminder of the icy grip that had latched onto her. Every step felt slower than it should have, like the hospital was somehow trying to hold her back. The eerie sound of the ventilator's rhythmic breathing seemed to follow her, chasing her through the hall. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Whatever had happened in that room wasn't finished with her yet, and she knew it. As she burst into the nurse's station, her colleagues glanced up in surprise, but Laura was already grabbing her things, mumbling something about needing to leave. The words felt jumbled, stuck in her throat as she tried to explain what she had just witnessed, but there was no time. The other nurses stared, confused, but Laura didn't care. She had to get out of that hospital. She couldn't stay another second in that cursed wing. With trembling hands, she clocked out, not even bothering to say goodbye as she rushed toward the exit. The cold night air outside was a shock to her system, but it did little to calm the panic that had wrapped itself around her chest. Her breath came out in short, frantic bursts as she fumbled with her car keys. She had to get away. Away from the hospital, away from that room, away from Mr. Barlow. But as she drove home, the rhythmic sound of the ventilator seemed to echo in her mind, growing louder with each passing second. She turned on the radio, trying to drown out the noise, but it was no use. The sound was inside her head now, following her wherever she went. At home, the silence should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Every corner of her apartment felt wrong, like something unseen had followed her from the hospital. Laura paced the room, her eyes darting toward every shadow, every flicker of movement. She knew it was irrational, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The cold sensation on her wrist, where the skeletal hand had gripped her, lingered as if the mark it left was more than just physical. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, the sound of the ventilator filled her ears. hissing, pumping, a grotesque reminder of what she had seen. And worse, every now and then, in the stillness of her darkened room, she swore she heard the faintest hint of breathing. Not her own, but something mechanical, inhuman. The sound would come in waves, filling the space around her before vanishing, leaving only the oppressive silence. Days passed, but the terror clung to Laura like a shadow. She quit her job the next morning, unable to step foot in that hospital again. She told herself that leaving would bring her peace, that she could move on and forget about what had happened. But deep down, she knew the truth. The thing that had latched onto her in that room wasn't bound by the hospital walls. It was something far darker, something that had marked her as its own. Even in the safety of her home, she could feel its presence. The cold breath on the back of her neck, the weight of unseen eyes watching her. She had escaped the hospital, but the terror wasn't over. Far from it. Weeks passed, but the sound of the ventilator never left Laura's mind. It started subtly at first, just a whisper of that mechanical breath whenever she was alone, late at night. But soon, it became more frequent. No matter where she went, the sound seemed to follow. She would hear it in her apartment, the soft, rhythmic hiss filling the quiet rooms. Even in the middle of the day, at the grocery store, or walking down the street, the sound would creep in. It was always there, just faint enough to make her question her sanity, but never so faint that she could ignore it. It wasn't just the sound, either. The cold feeling on her skin grew worse, like invisible hands were constantly brushing against her. She could feel it in the shower, the icy touch of something that didn't belong, lingering just out of sight. Laura would jump at every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. But the worst part was the sense that she was being watched. It was an oppressive presence, always hovering, waiting for something. And she knew exactly what it was waiting for. Her. One night, as she lay in bed, trying to calm her racing thoughts, Laura's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Her blood ran cold when she opened it. A single image flashed on her screen. The room where Mr. Barlow had died. The ventilator still hooked up, but the bed was empty. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. She hadn't told anyone about that night, hadn't shared her experience with a soul, and yet here it was, evidence that someone or something knew. That same night, Laura woke up in the early hours, drenched in sweat. The room was silent, but the sensation of the ventilator's breathing was so real, so close, that she could practically feel the air moving against her skin. Her chest tightened as she realized the sound wasn't just in her head anymore. It was coming from the corner of the room. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her head, and there it was, Mr. Barlow, or at least what was left of him. His body was slumped over, still attached to the ventilator, but his eyes were wide open, staring right at her. Laura's breath caught in her throat as the figure stood up, the ventilator still pumping air into his dead, decaying body. He took one slow, shuffling step toward her, and then another. The mechanical hiss of the ventilator filled the room, louder now, almost deafening. Laura couldn't move, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what was happening. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't respond. And then, as Mr. Barlow's cold, skeletal hand reached out toward her, she realized that this was what the presence had been waiting for all along. The following morning, Laura was found unconscious in her apartment, the room filled with an eerie, unnatural chill. She had no memory of what had happened after Mr. Barlow reached for her, but the sound of the ventilator never left her ears. It was a part of her now, as inescapable as her own heartbeat. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see his lifeless body, still moving, still breathing, and she knew that he was waiting for the right moment to take her. The terror that had started in the hospital had followed her home, and there was no escaping it. Laura's fate was sealed, and she knew it. The ventilator's grip on her was tightening, its cold breath always hovering just out of sight, waiting to claim her as it had claimed Mr. Barlow. But what terrified her most wasn't the thought of her own end. It was the knowledge that when it came for her, it wouldn't stop there. The cycle would continue, the ventilator would move on, looking for its next victim. The shadow that had haunted her every step wasn't finished, not by a long shot. David Turner, a 34-year-old graphic designer, had never been particularly fond of hospitals. Who is, right? But when a minor surgery was scheduled to fix an old injury, he figured he'd be in and out in no time. The hospital was small and local, tucked away in a quiet part of town. It wasn't the place you'd imagine for cutting-edge medical procedures, but it got the job done. The surgery itself went smoothly, or at least that's what the doctors told him when he woke up in recovery. He was groggy, but everything seemed fine at first. The strange part started when they told him they were moving him to a different ward. Overcrowding, they said, but David could sense something was off. Instead of being placed with the other adults, he was wheeled into a wing that seemed far too quiet, the pediatric ward. Temporarily repurposed, they explained, though the cold, sterile air didn't feel like it had been touched by children in years. The pastel walls and cartoonish murals only made the silence more eerie. David thought it was his nerves still frazzled from the surgery, nothing more. As he settled into his bed that first night, the overwhelming sense of something being wrong only grew. The hallway outside his door stretched into shadows, and there wasn't the usual hospital bustle of nurses and patients. Instead, there was this stillness, too much stillness for a place that was supposed to be full of life, even if it was just temporary. The quiet was thick, pressing in on him, making him feel more alone than he had in a long time. He shifted in the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling over his skin. It didn't help that the room he was placed in felt far too big, especially for just one person. The bed creaked as he moved, the sound echoing in the empty space. David chuckled to himself, trying to lighten the mood. Hospitals are creepy at night, he muttered under his breath, as if saying it out loud would dispel the tension in the air. But even as he tried to close his eyes and get some rest, his mind couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't as alone as he thought. Every time he dozed off, he would jolt awake, feeling like someone was watching him. Maybe it was just the aftermath of anesthesia, or maybe it was just his imagination, but it felt too real. He glanced at the door a few times, half expecting to see someone walk in, but no one ever did. The nurses only came by during the day, and at night, the ward was left in an eerie, echoing silence. As his eyes drifted shut one last time that night, David couldn't help but feel like the real recovery was just beginning, but not in the way he had expected. On his second night in the pediatric ward, David found it impossible to sleep. He tossed and turned, feeling more restless than before. The silence in the hospital was almost oppressive, and the faint hum of distant machines did little to soothe him. Sometime in the dead of night, he heard something unusual, a faint humming. At first, he thought it might be another patient or a nurse going about their duties, but the sound didn't seem to come from the usual hospital clatter. No, this was different. It had a melody to it, something soft but haunting. David sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound grew closer, but when he looked out into the hallway, it was empty. For a moment, he wondered if his tired mind was playing tricks on him, but the humming persisted. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. A small figure, just barely illuminated by the dim light. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, wearing a hospital gown that hung loosely from her frail frame. Her pale skin almost seemed to glow in the darkness, and her eyes, they were hollow, empty. She moved slowly, her steps light and almost floating, as if her feet barely touched the ground. David blinked, thinking she would vanish like a dream, but she remained, wandering down the hall as she hummed that eerie tune. His heart raced. What was a child doing here, alone, at this hour? He called out to her, his voice hoarse and uncertain, but she didn't respond. Instead, she continued walking, her head slightly tilted, as though she didn't hear him at all. David watched in confusion, unsure whether to get out of bed and follow her or to stay put. Something about the way she moved, the way she seemed to glide through the corridor, made his skin crawl. There was something deeply unsettling about her presence, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. But before he could process it further, she disappeared around the corner, leaving nothing but silence in her wake. The next morning, David mentioned the girl to the nurse who came to check on him. Her face immediately shifted, a shadow of discomfort crossing her features. "There are no children in this ward," she said flatly, her voice tight. When he pressed further, asking if maybe she had seen something strange, the nurse simply shook her head and hurried out of the room. The reaction left David even more unnerved. He had seen her. He knew he had. But why was everyone so quick to dismiss it? That night, as the darkness settled in again, David couldn't shake the image of the girl from his mind. Her empty eyes, the dark stains on her hospital gown. He tried to sleep, but every creak of the building, every whisper of wind against the windows, reminded him of that haunting figure. The humming returned, soft and distant, pulling him back into that same state of unease. By the third night, David was beginning to dread the coming of darkness. The hospital, which had once felt like a place of healing, now felt like a trap. He tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. Maybe the pain meds were making him hallucinate, or perhaps it was just his anxiety playing tricks on him. But none of those explanations seemed to stick, especially when she returned. The little girl, pale and ghostly, now stood at the foot of his bed. This time, she didn't hum. She just stared at him, her wide, hollow eyes locked on his. Her hospital gown seemed dirtier now, the dark stains more pronounced, as if they were spreading. David's heart pounded in his chest. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though her presence drained the air from the room, leaving only a suffocating silence between them. And then, in the faintest whisper, she spoke. "Will you stay with me forever?" Her voice was small, fragile, but the words sent chills down his spine. David felt paralyzed, unable to move, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but all he could do was watch as she slowly faded away, dissolving into the shadows like a bad dream. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and even after she was gone, the air felt heavy, oppressive. It was like she had left a part of herself behind, lingering in the corners of the room. The next morning, David was a wreck. His body ached from the lack of sleep, his nerves frayed beyond repair. He tried to ask the nurses again about the little girl, but their responses were always the same. No children had been admitted to the ward in years. It made no sense. He was seeing her, speaking to her, and yet no one believed him. Was he losing his mind? Or was there something far more sinister at play? The questions gnawed at him, but no one seemed to have any answers. As the days passed, the girl's visits became more frequent. Every night, without fail, she appeared at the foot of his bed, her eyes wide and unblinking. Each time, she would ask him the same question, her voice more insistent. "Will you stay with me forever?" David's health began to deteriorate. The sleepless nights, the constant fear, the overwhelming sense that something was very, very wrong. It was all taking a toll. He felt trapped, suffocated by the hospital's eerie silence and the girl's haunting presence. David knew he couldn't keep this up. He had to find a way to understand what was happening, to make sense of the impossible. But every time he tried to talk to someone about it, they brushed him off, treating him like a patient whose mind had been addled by surgery and medication. He felt alone, isolated, like the hospital was hiding something from him, something dark and terrible. And as much as he wanted to leave, something inside him told him that leaving might not be enough to escape her. Desperation led David to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't just sit there waiting for the girl to reappear every night, asking him that same chilling question. He needed answers, and if the staff wasn't going to give them to him, he'd find them himself. The hospital had a library, mostly for patients looking for something to read while recovering, but David had something else in mind. He began digging through old records, hospital archives, anything that could give him a clue about what was happening in that pediatric ward. It wasn't long before he stumbled across something unsettling, an old newspaper clipping from decades ago. The article detailed a tragedy involving a young girl who had died in the very ward David was now staying in. According to the report, she had been admitted for a routine procedure, but due to a catastrophic error, she was given the wrong medication. The mistake wasn't caught in time, and the girl suffered a slow, agonizing death. Her parents had sued the hospital, but nothing ever came of it. The case had been buried, and the ward had been closed shortly after. David's heart sank as he read the story. This had to be her, the girl who had been visiting him every night. But that didn't explain why she was still there, why she was haunting him. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the truth. She wasn't just a ghost trapped in the hospital. She was looking for someone to stay with her, to replace her, to share in her eternal suffering. That's why she kept asking him that question, over and over. She wasn't going to let him leave, not without taking something from him. Armed with this grim knowledge, David tried to find out more about the hospital's past. He spoke to a few older nurses, ones who had been working there for decades. Most were tight-lipped, clearly uncomfortable with the subject, but one finally gave him a piece of the puzzle. She told him that after the girl's death, strange things started happening in the ward. Patients would hear a child's voice. Doctors would see fleeting glimpses of a little girl in the hallways, but every time they searched, she was gone. Eventually, the ward was shut down, and the events were all but forgotten. The nurse's words confirmed what David already feared. The girl wasn't just a lingering memory. She was still very much present, and she wasn't going to rest until someone took her place. It wasn't just about being haunted. This was a curse, one that had been festering in the walls of the hospital for decades. And now it had latched onto him. He had been chosen, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized there might be no way to escape her. With each passing day, the sense of dread grew heavier. David couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital itself was alive, that it was keeping him there, feeding off his fear, just like it had with the little girl all those years ago. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. The hospital wasn't just a place of healing, it was a prison, and he was its latest inmate. He needed to find a way out, but deep down, he knew that leaving the building might not be enough to free him from her grasp. By the fifth night, David could barely function. His body was weak, his mind a fog of exhaustion and fear. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel her, that little girl, hovering just out of sight. The humming had become constant, a low, insistent presence in the back of his mind. He knew that she was coming for him again, but this time, it felt different. The air in the room was thicker, colder, and he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be the night something would change, something final. As darkness fell, David tried to leave the hospital. He'd had enough. But every step toward the door felt like walking through molasses, like the hospital itself was pulling him back. His heart raced as he made his way to the elevator, but before he could press the button, the lights flickered, and there she was, standing just a few feet away, her pale face illuminated by the flickering fluorescent lights. Her eyes, wide and empty, stared into his soul, and she reached out with one small, trembling hand. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind. David backed away, his body trembling with fear, but there was nowhere to run. The hospital seemed to stretch endlessly around him, the walls closing in, the humming now deafening. She stepped closer, her cold fingers brushing against his arm. The touch sent a jolt of ice through his veins, freezing him in place. Her once small, fragile voice now sounded desperate, pleading, "Stay with me, forever." He felt the weight of those words pressed down on him, suffocating, as though she was trying to pull him into her world. In a moment of sheer panic, David shoved her away and bolted back to his room, slamming the door behind him. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he knew it wasn't over. She would come for him again, and next time, he might not be able to fight her off. He sank to the floor, his back against the door, trembling. He couldn't leave. He couldn't stay. No matter where he went, she would find him. She had chosen him, and there was no escaping it. The next morning, he left the hospital, physically at least. But even as he stepped out into the sunlight, the feeling of her presence never left him. The air still felt thick. The shadows still seemed to move out of the corner of his eye. At home, the humming followed him, creeping through the silence of his apartment. No matter how far he went, he could feel her watching, waiting for the moment when he would let his guard down. The moment she would finally claim him. Now, David lives in constant fear, knowing that he can never truly escape her. Every night he hears that faint humming, growing louder, closer, as though she is just outside his door, waiting for him to fall asleep. He knows that someday he won't be able to resist her any longer. Someday he'll have to answer her call, and when that day comes, there will be no turning back. Until then, he waits, haunted by the girl who will never let him go. And she waits too, knowing that he belongs to her now.